You're listening to a social justice podcast, an exploration of our world's social issues, hosted by NICOLA SPURLING on the traditional and unceded territories of the Kwikwetlem, Katzie, and Qayqayt peoples. Hello, this is a social justice podcast. I'm your host, NICOLA SPURLING, and today I'm joined by Celeste Trianon. Thank you for joining the podcast. Can you introduce yourself briefly?
Such a pleasure. So, hey there, I'm Celeste, she, her pronouns, trans activist and jurist-based in Joggy, colonially known as Montreal. I do tons of trans activism all across Northern Ireland, also known as Canada, and in particular, legal work, focused primarily on providing good information to trans communities, offering low-cost, low-barrier, and sometimes even no-cost services, notably for name changes and for other things like that. I'm also soon to be finished with my law degree. As of the moment of recording, I'm about a month and a half away from doing that. So, yeah.
Wow, that's exciting that you're so close. And I mean, I know all about your trans advocacy work because you're everywhere. You're sort of all over the country and you're in media articles all the time. So to start with, what motivated you to become a trans advocate?
I mean, for me, it first began primarily out of obligation in a way. So, primarily at, working in a nonprofit sector and really beginning in the nonprofit sector because of notably risking being homeless, owing to having parents with very hateful views. So,
Mm,
unfortunately, it's kind of like your typical trans sob story, which which has, in a way, kind of spiraled and ballooned after Quebec introduced its first ever anti-trans bill back in 2021, which very much forced me and kind of propelled me into much more of a prominent role than I would have expected at the time. And I guess since then, I've just really been at the forefront with almost no exception.
right. And I think a lot of people that grow up in I guess, an instance where you are facing hateful views and you're surrounded by that, it's really difficult to come out. Did you really struggle with the process of coming out as trans, or was that something you just said, I need to separate myself from this sort of hateful environment and be myself?
I mean, it's been tough, and I mean, everyone's coming out story is different. But I'll say, for someone who learned the word trans maybe a few months before coming out, who has taken, trans rights campaign posters as simply feminist campaign posters, for someone who's been basically almost woefully blind about trans issues for the longest time, it's really been a struggle. And I'll say, I really wish I maybe had learned more about it explicitly at a younger age, but unfortunately that just didn't turn out to be me.
So you transitioned as an adult, I'm guessing based on that.
Nope,
Is that
as a
right?
teenager.
As a teenager, okay. So, you've been out for a while now. You're still quite young, I think. I don't know your exact age, but you sort of popped into the scene. You've really created a name for yourself here, and then you started this legal clinic. So, can you talk about how you went from being a trans advocate or transitioning, becoming a trans advocate, and then starting a legal clinic? That's quite the progression that you've gone through.
Absolutely. So that story also begins with that same anti-trans bill I mentioned previously, which is Quebec Bill 2, which was actually primarily anti-trans, not because of ill intention from the government here, but primarily because because the government had listened to one too many anti-trans groups without actually consulting the community. So basically, gross negligence.
Right.
And from there, I kind of led, the campaign in Quebec to fight back against that bill and succeeded in a way. And that meant that non-binary gender markers were finally legalized for once. The community, myself included, pushed also very hard for material changes to help, legal name changes. In particular, waiving fees altogether for first-time trans applicants for name changes, which honestly BC ought to do soon. It's ridiculous to pay $137 for an application. You had suddenly the law was changed. Being non-binary was finally legalized in Quebec. Gender marker changes were finally free of charge, but no one knew what to do.
Right.
So I guess within the span of about a week and a half, I just whipped up an emergency legal service to help people obtain legal name changes and legal gender marker changes. It was at first just a quick 1 week long pop-up that I ran through other organizations. So it was never meant to be something permanent. It was just something I was going to do for the sake of helping community for a little bit. In 1 week, I had 150 people ask my help.
Wow. So there's really a huge amount of demand for that. And it's
Ye
interesting to hear that there's such a wide difference in what that name change process looks like across the country. Because as you mentioned in BC, we generally consider ourselves to be quite progressive when it comes to trans issues, but we also charge quite a bit for those name change applications. And in
Indeed.
that sense, you would
And
potentially say Quebec is more progressive.
yeah, then you throw on other requirements, like, for example, the new criminal record check requirement as enacted by the BC Name Amendment Act just last year.
Absolutely. There's all sorts of requirements. And I mean, as someone who does your advocacy work across Canada, I'm sure you're pretty in tune with what the differences are between these provinces. But before we get into that, can you talk about why that work of helping people with their name and gender marker changes is so important? Like, why? I know this from personal experience, but why is it so important for trans people to have the ability to access those services for our audience members who might not be as familiar with that?
Say, first and foremost, it's a question of both legal recognition, but also material advances for the community. So it's not just about having like the proper name or the proper gender marker on a piece of ID, but it's also being able to apply for jobs safely without having to out yourself as trans, being able to get yourself an apartment without that, and also just not having to constantly have to explain folks that you're trans, etc. It significantly reduces the barrier to transitioning and to living in public and living a life in general as a trans person. It's only really recent that like certain institutions like universities and a few select banks take into account people's chosen names. Before then, and even just 10 years ago, it was not a possibility almost anywhere. So let's just not forget how important it is for people to be recognized as themselves, especially in a road in which legal identification becomes more and more important, as can be told by just how much passports and ID cards have become such a massive thing, especially in the last 25 or something years. It only furthers the necessity for people to have correct ID in the first place.
And one of the more recent changes, too, is having the ability to add an X to your identification. So it used to be that you would have an M or an F, male or female, on your identification. Now we have this X option for people who are non-binary. And is that something that people are able to access in every province in Canada at the moment?
Yes, since last October. I'm
Right. So
not sure
that's a
about
federal
Nunavut
change.
though. I have to verify, but apart from Nunavut, which I have to confirm with, it's been the case since October 2024. So very recent. And guess who was
Hmm.
last? Quebec.
Right. Of course. And do you know much about what it's like to travel with an X marker on your identification? I've heard that people can run into challenges if you're going to a country that's maybe not as safe and they see that that's an identification that you have. Do you know much about that?
I don't have personal lived experience, but it
Mhm.
absolutely is a struggle. Like, for example, right now, the US, most obvious example, has complete, effectively has complete illegalized transness as a whole at the federal level. And there's even like criminal bans on transness being introduced in certain US states as well. So it's not exactly safe to be out as trans in many of those environments. And having an X on ID basically automatically outs you as trans. In both BC and Quebec, it's impossible to assign someone with an X gender marker at birth. So this means that, by extension, anyone who has an X gender marker is probably trans and will probably face the consequences thereof, notably transphobia. So it absolutely is a struggle because it outs you automatically.
Right. And you mentioned not being able to have an X marker at birth. There are intersex people that are born, and there's often talk about how intersex people are treated when they're born, right? There used to be surgeries that were performed pretty regularly when that happened. I don't know what the prevalence of that is today, but
Oh, it's still pretty common.
it's still pretty common. Is there a reason why an intersex person couldn't be given an X on their birth certificate so that they could make up their mind about what gender they are in the future?
Honestly, I cannot speak for intersex folks, but at
Mhm.
least from what I understand, which is from my past advocacy work, it's that it would, out people as intersex, and that could also, pose risk and further encourage practices such as intersex genital mutilation. So, in an attempt to avoid that, folks generally prefer like a parent's preference for gender assignment with like easy access changes afterwards.
Right.
I mean, like, I cannot speak for them though, so like that is not my, it's outside my field of expertise.
Right, absolutely. Is that something you've encountered though throughout your work? People who are intersex and have been assigned the incorrect gender and are switching it, or is that maybe not something that people are disclosing to you when they are going through that gender process or
It's not
change of
really
ID?
something folks disclose, and I
Hmm.
very much make it clear, folks should not have to disclose everything about themselves to access many changes. So I tend to even forget the folks who come at the legal clinic like as soon as their forms are submitted.
Right. They come in, you do the work that they need, and then you sort of say, "Oh, okay, I'm not gonna, keep in mind what your old name was or what your old gender was or any of that."
Mhm. Yeah,
Um,
so that privacy is so important.
right, absolutely. And I imagine when you're dealing with the legal profession too, there's a certain amount of client confidentiality. Does that apply in the work that you're doing as well?
I mean, for me, it's just legal information. It's not legal advice, which means I'm not, playing the role of a lawyer, but nonetheless, I still try to maintain best practices, and I really, I just conserve confidentiality as if I was a lawyer in a way. Even though it's like a bit softer, I always just make sure to, even though it's definitely softer because you're not doing like a law reserved act, you're still nonetheless like it's so important to preserve folks' confidentiality, not out people, etc. If folks want more confidentiality, it's something you would always want to grant them. You don't. There used to be a time when name changes were published publicly in the newspaper, and even nowadays there still are online registers and places where you can find that. So it's so important to try to avoid making it such a avoid outing each other.
Right. And with that in mind too, when the government is making these changes, because these documents get submitted to the government and then they have to make these changes to your identification, what happens to the information about that after the fact? Like, does the government keep a registry of who's transitioned? Because I know that that's a fear that a lot of trans people have. If we get a
Well,
government that hates us and they want to persecute us, they can just look up this list of everyone who's had their gender changed and target us that way.
oh, absolutely. Like, I'll say pretty much every government I know does this. Like, they oftentimes, if you're doing filing, for example, an application for gender marker change, they'll just merely swap out, old information for new information, but there's going to be a record of the fact that it's been swapped. It's why you can still order gender change certificates like years down the line without any issues. But it's also very much a violation of people's privacy and can very much lead to people being forcibly detransitioned, as we're seeing right now with, for example, the United States with their passports.
Right. And speaking of the US, we see the rights of trans people in the US under attack. And if the conservatives in Canada were to get their way, we'll probably see more attacks on trans rights here as well. So, what do we need to be aware of with regard to legal challenges for trans people here in Canada?
I'd say the biggest thing we need to be afraid of is the notwithstanding clause. So I'm sure you're aware of it. Section 33 of the Canadian Charter, it basically acts as a valve which allows any human rights as protected by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms to be ignored temporarily. So this is exactly why, for example, you can have governments union passing special laws to union bust, or it's also made a reason why, for example, in Quebec here, we have a ban on teachers wearing hijabs. It's specifically because there is a law enabling the government to do so, which officially allows the government to, do whatever it wants, notwithstanding the Canadian Charter. And pretty much all human rights protections that we have right now, whether it be the fact that sexual orientation is included in the Alberta Human Rights Act, or the fact that trans people can be legally recognized, how trans people are, a protected ground under the Canadian Charter, how we have access to anti-discrimination protections, notably ones in employment, all of that, and even your right to unionize for maybe maybe your audience was like not aware of trans issues. All of these rights are guaranteed only because of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's
Mhm.
not something which is merely just granted, and it's a right which unfortunately can be taken away almost any moment. We're kind of pretending it's not a big deal right now, but it very much is because I'll say, as ridiculous as it sounds, Canada might have less protections for human rights were there to no, if the notwithstanding clause is used on a blanket basis, would have less human rights protections than even the US.
Mhm. When I was talking to one of our past podcast guests, Barbara Finley, about this, and it sounds like the notwithstanding clause or the use of it in this instance is being challenged. But if that challenge isn't successful and it becomes or it could become standard practice for the notwithstanding clause to be used when provincial legislation is introduced at any point, and then it essentially renders our charter irrelevant in some ways. So,
Exactly.
how much of a fear is that, do you think?
It's enormous. I'd say on a tier level scale from 0 to 10, probably a 99. I'll say
Wow.
if the charter becomes toilet paper, it effectively is that. It's toilet paper, it's nothing else.
Mhm. And then we are basically just relying on provincial legislation to govern how we operate, kind of like the US is trying to push this idea that states should essentially decide everything. It would be sort of that mentality as well here.
Exactly. So with Canadian federalism, there's also the risk of criminal laws banning gender-affirming care, etc., which could all be passed at the federal level. I would have a blanket application across country. And I'm gonna say, if that happens here, we're gonna have trans people fleeing to countries, probably in Europe, or like for example Thailand, or like other countries which are more trans inclusive, and claim refugee status there. Imagine being a refugee from Canada.
Right.
That is what
Yeah.
can happen.
I mean, that's really scary to think about the fact that things could shift for us so quickly. And I guess if we have this perfect storm, you end up having the charter rendered almost irrelevant by the fact that the notwithstanding clause can be used on blanket, which hopefully doesn't happen. And then you end up getting a conservative government like the one that we have right now that wants to attack trans folks. We could
Indeed.
see that shift within a few years, I imagine, right?
Well, given enough vitriol, it could even be a question of weeks.
Wow.
Like, look at
That's
how quickly Trump has swooped against trans people. Just look at how quickly we've gone from a country which is still relatively maybe mid-tier when it comes to trans rights to being almost as unsafe as Hungary.
and beyond trying to protect the charter and stop the notwithstanding clause from becoming mainstream and being used for everything essentially, what
Hmm.
can be done from a legal perspective to protect trans folks in Canada, or is there anything besides that that can be done?
Say, apart from that, we also need to address the fact that most often people who have their rights violated do not have access to a lawyer. They don't have access to proper legal representation because more often than not, they can't afford it, and there's basically no trans competent lawyers in so many places around here. Like BC, in a way, almost is the exception because of how many wonderful trans lawyers, especially trans lawyers working with trans people, there are. Here in Quebec, we have practically none in a way, or at least so few that I can't even tell off the top of my head. So we're really seeing, how unfortunately the fact that people don't have access to proper legal representation means that even the most illegal act, like blatantly firing someone and saying it's because they're trans,
Mhm.
even the most blatant act like that could end up going unpunished.
Right. And I don't have a great understanding of this, but again, with my conversations that I've had with Barbara Finley, it sounded as though even if the notwithstanding clause becomes commonplace, there's still the criminal code that would apply. And so for something like conversion therapy, which is included in the criminal code, there's a ban on that criminally. We have
Hmm.
sought a ban on conversion therapy provincially here in BC. It's been denied
Hmm.
twice by the provincial government here. Is there a risk that if we're relying on the provinces solely to basically dictate what the rules are, that opens us back up to having conversion therapy? Or does that criminal code still apply and prevent that from happening at a provincial level as well?
I mean, I'm gonna say very blatantly, it's already happening. It's already happening in
Mm.
the form of people, jurisdiction shopping, and people from like most notably the US running operations targeting people north of the border. So it even though it is illegal right now across Canada federally, it doesn't really make a huge difference because at the end of the day, people are still doing it and they're going unpunished because the jurisdictions where the people practicing conversion therapy are, it's perfectly legal or even encouraged by the government. So we're seeing how because of the fact that there's not enough restrictions, and because of the fact that there's almost no recourse for people living here, people can nonetheless still be affected and could easily have a highly transphobic parent here, like say in BC or in Quebec, drive down their kids to drive down their kids to Utah or something and keep the
Right.
day.
So they're escaping that jurisdictional issue.
Indeed. I mean, it could be called child abduction or kidnapping, but in practice, if both parents consent to that, there's pretty much no recourse.
I kind of wonder how we even got to this place where, regardless of whether or not these legal protections exist, why are we as a society, and I don't mean you and I, but the folks who are sort of anti-trans, why has that become a thing, right? Like,
Hmm.
it seems as if it's a non-issue, right? The participation of trans people in sports is often talked about. It's really such a minor thing that happens. The
Indeed.
use of washrooms, it doesn't cause any issues, and yet people are sort of riled up about it. It seems like it's all fueled by disinformation campaigns that are being led by maybe a small group, a small vocal group of people that just hate trans folks like us. So Can you maybe explain how that disinformation fuels anti-trans legislation?
Oh, absolutely. I'll say so much of this begins because people wanting to hate on trans people have to find the reasons that can easily be both cited by the media or can easily be, pushed forwards in order for it to pass. It's why bathroom bills in 2016, 2017, early with Trump in the US, how that did not work. I had the North Carolina's House Bill 2, which ended up, causing a huge boycott in that state. You had
Hmm.
that, which ended up being successful in a way because of the fact that people saw this for what it is, which is dehumanization. But unfortunately, we've reached a point in which, where anti-trans discourse has become so normalized and so widespread because of, no, most notably, news outlets spewing anti-trans almost consistently that you end up seeing trans people go from being people to a mere concept or even worse, a so-called ideology in their brains. That's why you see statistics which recurrently say that the most effective way to attack transphobia is knowing another trans person. It's why, for example, today, as the day of recording, how Montana in the US has several anti-trans bills were successfully and bipartisanly defeated because of trans legislators rehumanizing their community in, the legislature. And that's something where, unfortunately, we're missing in quite a few places. And here, the
Hmm.
whole reason why for so many folks were able to get away with it, it's precisely because they're given the room to dehumanize, and you then have puppets like Rebel News, and I'm not going to name drop too many far right news outlets being able to further spread this info and create, fear that may at first seem reasonable, but which inevitably boils down to prejudice.
Right.
It's why you with sports. It's because it's the most accessible thing. It's basically a strongman for every other anti-trans thing ever.
And I wonder how you even address that disinformation. It seems like people are so set in wanting to support a certain position that they don't care about the facts anymore. I
Mhm.
recently saw a post by Elon Musk on X, which is his own platform, and there are community notes under it saying this is incorrect, and yet his supporters will still support these posts that he's making, even though his own community notes are saying they're incorrect. And I don't understand the cognitive dissonance that's required to continue to support something when the facts are right in front of
Mm.
you stating this is not actually true.
See, so much of this is just a bombardment of hate followed by, confirmation bias. We're seeing how this is continuing, with people who have already been primed to accept anti-trans hate at face value, being further, confirmed by the fact whenever, there's even more reports by oftentimes mainstream media that further confirms anti-trans beliefs. It's why, for example, it's much easier to loop people into anti-feminist thinking once you get them down the anti-trans pipeline. It's
Mm.
it all it's all continuation. It's all a continuum.
Right. So, does that mean that there is no sort of solution in terms of being able to fact check people and swing them back the other way, and we just have to sort of accept that we're going down this path of division where one side is going to be on the side of truth and the other side is going to go with their feelings and what they think is wrong about the world, regardless of whether or not that's actually
Mm,
true?
I'd say you have to pop your bubble,
Mm.
and that's always gonna be hard. I'd say whether it be meeting other trans people or, seeing us live and, even just addressing this info one day at a time, you really need to break that cognitive dissonance between like fact and the unfact and
Hmm.
make sure that fact ends up being the thing what ends up coming through. I'll say, scientific journals, as much as they're the gold standard for so many of us, your average person might not be even able to read a scientific journal. You
Hmm.
need to also be able to dissect that information and make it very accessible to folks because as much as like we can say that science is on our side, science can be so easily disregarded as well, as we're seeing, both with anti-trans movements and like say the anti-vaccine movement. So we
Right.
absolutely need to go through with that, with rehumanizing, with kind of that emotional appeal as well, to make sure that those folks are more receptive to the truth in a way.
Right. And then you end up with studies that are not peer reviewed, that are completely flawed, and people use those to try to bolster their beliefs. And I guess it
Yep.
comes back to that idea of you need to humanize trans people somehow. So making sure that everyone knows a trans person. And I do this in BC, where I try to encourage all of our politicians to actually go out in their community and meet one trans person and talk to them about how the issues or how the legislation that they're putting forward affects them in community. And like most of the MLAs don't know a single trans person. And I think that that's
Immediate.
incredibly problematic. But even more problematic is that the population as a whole doesn't seem to know any trans people. And I mean, they do. They're seeing us in passing, and they probably just don't realize it, or they come across us online and they don't really stop and engage. But how do you maybe
Mhm.
make that introduction, do you think, to a trans person, or to at least learning a little bit more about what it is that it means to be trans?
I'd say easiest way is just reaching out, to reach out and having conversations. And I'll say, as much as many of us are completely fatigued from having to constantly re-explain our realities, we're here, and like I'm sure many of us would still be willing to have a proper conversation. It's
Mhm.
by meeting people. It's by being out there and being open-minded first and foremost. Now, say it's not even that hard to find a trans person. Just ask your local queer community, or it might be a place you've never been to before, but you can begin there.
So it requires that they take that step, or is there maybe a solution where we as trans people are going out and meeting them where they are? And I know you talked about how we're all fatigued, right? And
Yeah.
definitely when you get involved in trans advocacy work, it's really tiring. Do you do you think that that's a step that people need to start taking? Do you have an issue with trans people not being out because it prevents that from happening?
I'd say definitely talking about trans issues is definitely possible. And I'd say most oftentimes the easiest ways to begin with friends, family, etc. It's at this very hyper local level, which oftentimes is neglected when we talk about advocacy work at large. So beginning with those connections, even just your neighborhood, your neighbors, etc., your local community center, those are perfect places to like just be present as a trans person. At the same time, I'll admit it, it can be tough to, like, make those connections at first, and, like, for a lot of folks, they might not feel safe coming out each year, which I would say in this current political climate, it absolutely can be safer to not be out, to go complete stealth, and it absolutely is safer for many, many of us because it's just not safe anymore.
Mhm.
So there's no shame in needing to hide as well.
Right. So as it only go out and make those connections in that way if you feel safe doing so. And if you're a trans person who does not feel safe, or legitimately is not safe, it's perfectly fine to sort of stay stealth, as you might say, which our audience might not understand, but basically going through the world without people realizing that you're trans, and viewing you as a cis person.
Indeed.
Hmm. And you've written about the parallels between 1933 Germany and modern day USA. I'm curious to know if you can elaborate on some of those similarities and what we need to look out for in terms of not going down that same path.
Absolutely. I'd say the biggest similarities right now we're seeing is just total dehumanization and censorship. So first, the destruction of the very idea of transness and the very knowledge that about trans people and on trans people. We're seeing scientific articles be retracted. We're seeing a literal digital book burning because it's no longer possible to really physically burn them. So because everything's online, so we just take everything down from the internet. It's why there's such a massive wave of censorship right now. Basically, everything related to the U.S. government, anything trans, is being completely censored, defunded, etc. It's it's the same playbook. It might not be books, but it is equally a form of epistemic genocide, of elimination of knowledge about an entire group for the intent of, you know, dehumanizing them. So
Hmm.
that is very much like the biggest taboo I'd say. It's that precisely. But also it's about systematic dehumanization and just making trans people unpersons in a way, of making them subhuman and kind of creating an excuse to make it so that your average person out there wouldn't feel guilty if, for example, they hate crime with a trans person. It's
Mm.
it's all about that. It's all about, dehumanizing to such a point where a government can effectively, quote unquote, have their hands clean by almost in a way downloading like the whole act of causing actual violence to local police officers and to local communities.
Hmm. When we talked about humanizing trans people by creating those connections and learning about what it means to be trans, and I guess when you have these maybe not, mass scale book burnings like we saw in Germany in the 30s, but
Mm.
instead you have these bans on books that are allowed to be taught in schools. It's the same sort of effect where it removes that knowledge from people and makes it easier to dehumanize groups of people. Would you say
Indeed.
that that's similar?
Oh, absolutely. And I'll say, if you can read a banned book, please do. Like, there's a reason why they're trying to censor 1984 and The Handmaid's Tale right now. There's a reason they're trying to censor Bravely Road and Fahrenheit 451. And those classics are being censored alongside trans books. They're being censored for the same reason.
Right. Which is funny because a lot of critics of trans folks or people that hate us, they actually like to cite 1984. And I always get the sense they've never actually read the book if they're trying to use it against us because the playbook that they're using aligns so closely with.
Oh, I know. It's the Matrix. It's so many other, pieces of popular culture just being completely misunderstood. Like you
Hmm.
can definitely I say, I don't know what I don't know how good literacy rates are around society nowadays, but I sure hope people still do know how to read books because sometimes, at least looking in the US, it sure feels like people just don't know anymore.
Right. Or at least take out an audiobook if you don't have that same literacy level. I think you get a lot
Yeah,
of information from just listening to books as well. And
indeed.
I'm curious to know, you talked about how Canadians might become refugees and have to move to other countries. There are currently not a lot of countries that are more accepting of trans people than Canada. Obviously,
Indeed.
that can change, as we talked about. But there are plenty of countries, and I just went traveling, that I would not feel safe going to. But I know that also people don't want to restrict themselves from being able to explore the world around them. So, do you maybe have advice for trans people who are thinking about traveling? I don't know if people are traveling to the US. They probably shouldn't at this point in time. We have a trade war
You
going
have
on,
a
but
I think government personal travel warning, and apparently other like certain official government authorities, such as Germany, are now officially putting official travel warnings as well for trans people to the
Mhm.
US.
Right. And the US is not the only country where it's going to be dangerous to travel as a trans person.
Mhm.
So I'm just curious if a trans person is either forced into a situation where they're having to travel, maybe it's for work, maybe it's
Mm.
because they have family in a certain location, maybe they're just wanting to explore the world and they don't want to limit themselves. What advice would you have for them if they're traveling to countries that are maybe less accepting?
I'd say first and foremost, I'd say, of course, avoiding jurisdiction which blatantly criminalizes transness. That's absolutely the case. Like avoid Texas, Florida, etc. Avoid say those countries at all costs. Countries or states at all costs.
Mhm.
That's a part of that as well. If you want to travel elsewhere, I'd say passing privilege is unfortunately a very huge thing. For a
Right.
lot of folks you who might be gender non-conforming, but who are able to pass as their birth assigned gender, it could also be, safer to travel like that. If you are a Canadian citizen, you can also apply for a Canadian passport as of now with a different gender marker than the one on your provincial IDs, which means, for example, if you have an X on a, say, your BC ID card or your driver's license, etc., you can also apply for one with, say, an M or an F. You can also travel with
Oh,
that
okay.
instead. And
Right, so you
just
would
remember that
actually sometimes recommend that someone who has an X on their ID gets another ID that doesn't have an X on it for the purposes of being safer when they're traveling?
indeed, and with passports and other federal documents right now, as of today, it is possible. So I very much recommend it to anyone who's considering. Who I know, a lot of folks, in fact, who are debating whether they want to change their legal gender marker here or no, specifically for the reasons of travel. So I'll just say that that is not a limitation. So you will need to have your passport in the same name as your provincial ID. So,
Right.
generally speaking, so it very much is kind of a limitation here as well. So
Mhm,
definitely there's that, I would say. And say finally, just if a local community at your destination, ask around. Like
mhm,
I know for a fact, for example, I traveled to Finland last year and it was quite safe for me because I had friends there.
mhm.
So I would meet up with them. But might not be the case if, for example, you're primarily sticking to tourist sites or if you're going into more rural areas, say for example. So of course there's all those micro considerations you do want to take into account as well.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I talked a little bit about how someone might have to travel for work. I'm currently in the job market, and so I'm looking at jobs, and this is partly why I was thinking about that. But one of the things that happens as a trans person in the workforce, or when you're applying for jobs, is you often get this line, "You don't fit with our company culture," right?
Oh,
And
absolutely.
So we think that there's these protections for trans folks in the workplace. We think that there are, the Human Rights Code is going to prevent an employer from saying, we're not going to hire you because you're trans. But in reality, they're finding these workarounds. Is there recourse for that? Or would you just say, well, if a company is doing that, you don't want to work for them anyway. And so just avoid that.
I
Because
mean,
it's a tricky situation if you need to make money, right?
the latter indeed is true in a way, but I would say at the same time, it is kind of it's hard to get enough evidence in order to prove discrimination. And that's the whole point of, people and especially employers, using circular logic like this. It's much easier to get a claim if you're fired, like, say, the day after coming out. Like, got a case here and got a few cases here in Quebec, even from the 90s, where that was the case. And people, end up getting human rights judgments in their favor.
Hmm.
So I would say, it's tough, but at the same time, it could be safer to apply for job stealth or, in a way which not necessarily out your identity. And there are ways to do so, especially if you have, like, say, you have, like, the means to, you have, like, correct ID or other such means. It can also be safer. Of
Yeah.
course, coming out, at the end of the day, it's personal choice and can also be limited to certain environments, etc. Can, of course, do that.
Right, because when you're coming out, you might put yourself at risk. So there's instances where someone might actually even stay in the closet for longer than they want to because they're trying to keep
Yeah.
themselves safe.
I
Mhm.
know some folks who are coming out in their 60s right now after their retirement.
Yeah, I mean, I know people that have come out to me a decade ago and they still haven't come out. And it's because, they don't want to lose their kids or they don't want to put themselves in a situation where their family's cutting them off or they get fired from their job. So these are real considerations, even in places where
Mhm.
theoretically we have protections, right?
Indeed.
I know that you're incredibly busy traveling across the country, as I mentioned before, engaging in events, public speaking. Is there anything that you have coming up that you'd like to share with our audience?
Oh, absolutely. So for folks in BC, so on 29th of March, I'll be in town at Movie Trans History Force. I'll be presenting with Barbara on the Trans 5 alarm fire and the death of equality rights and other human rights here in Canada and how we can fight back against it. So for folks in Victoria, definitely look up Movie Trans History Forward. It's also available online. And on March 31st, I'm currently working on it. I've got plans to run an all fees paid for Transdeal Click for folks out of Vancouver
Mm.
with my friends at the community and the Community Concord West. So this is an initiative I've previously run before in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland as well, but be the first time I'm going to be doing it on the West Coast. And yeah, it's so unfortunate people still have to pay such huge fees to be able to get, legal trademark changes, legal name changes, etc. They want to fight against that. And, if what ends up happening is, using 10 grand in nonprofit money to pay for name changes, and so be it.
Right. So finding nonprofits that are able to assist folks in making those changes.
Yeah, and in this case, it's actually going to be my own nonprofit paying the
Mm.
funds. So, yeah,
Okay. And there's grant money available to support that, is there?
it's donation money. All
Is
from
donation money.
from the Translegal Defense Fund I created 2 years ago. Um, you know, just putting it back in the community out of for paying for name changes and all that. And it makes such a huge difference too. I've noticed it makes compared to, like, even, funding strategic litigation, it makes such a bigger difference, especially because you're helping so many more people be able to live their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. We're getting kind of close to the end of the questions that I have for you. Is there anything else that maybe we haven't talked about? We focused a lot on sort of the legal side of being trans, trying to focus on topics that I know are within your wheelhouse, but
Mm.
you're obviously a very well-rounded person. You're involved in a lot of trans advocacy, so I'm curious to know if there's anything else that we haven't touched on that you think would be important for the audience to know about.
Say, just talking about trans stuff, I could talk on and on about that. But I'll say,
Mm-hmm.
if there's one thing I really want to focus on, it's really not just like the whole legal stuff, but also everything social economic. It's everything related to, people's well-being, etc. And it's things that you might think initially primarily affect trans people, but in fact, it affects everyone. Whether it be low-paying jobs, low wages, union busting, as seen here in Quebec with Amazon, and maybe soon BC as well. A lot of things like that. There, there are issues with disproportionately affect the trans community, but which also disproportionately affects low-income workers, oftentimes immigrant families as well. People who very much, unfortunately do not have generational wealth or other forms of privilege.
Mhm.
So in a way, fighting for trans rights does not have to be just fighting for trans rights per se. It can also be fighting for justice in all its other forms. It can also be addressing the housing crisis and
Mm.
hopefully finally dragging down, the exorbitant amounts of rent out of Vancouver and, everywhere across Canada. It can also be, fighting for access to justice, fighting for more comprehensive legal aid programs. It can be that as well. There are so many ways to fight for, what is right. I strongly encourage you to get involved in a local cause like that. Because I'll say it, unless you are a billionaire, there's probably at least something and you can fight for, which will make your life better and which will also make our lives better.
Yeah, I mean, every issue we talk about on this podcast is sort of intersectional, right? We were focusing on one issue, but they're combined with all of these other issues that we're dealing with, and that's kind of the whole point of this, is to talk about a variety of social issues so people get a better understanding of them and how they're all interconnected. So that's a really important point to make. I also, I really want to come back to one point that you made when we were having that conversation about employment, which is that
Hmm.
someone who is looking to apply for a job, and this can probably apply to a few different avenues as well, where you think that there's legal protections in place, but people have the ability to skirt those legal protections. You had said people can be stealth about that, right? You can apply for a job, for instance, and not bring up the fact that you are trans. Is that also possible if you're trying to meet people where they're at and do that advocacy work? Because at a certain point, you've experienced this, I've experienced this, you get yourself into media articles. When someone Googles your name, they're going to immediately find out that you're trans. So, is that something that people need to be concerned about if they're deciding to go down that route of advocacy and engaging the public about what it means to be trans?
I'd say it needs to an extent, especially if you're known under your own name, which is the case
Mm.
for oftentimes, a lot of trans activists out here. They're oftentimes known as themselves. And say it's particularly the case when you end up becoming a public figure. There's no way around that, and there's no way back after that. But there are other
Right.
ways to come as well. Whether it be, really low key in a workplace where like you don't end up appearing too much online as who you are, or it could also be, in your advocacy within our group. Like for example, say you have so many activist groups out there, even whether it be on the West Coast, whether here, elsewhere, it can be with your local trans run collective, can be with your local trans run organizing group. It doesn't have to be under your own name. And there are ways to fight for that and, be anonymous whilst, fighting for what's just. And for many communities, that has always been a necessity. So I'd very much just emphasize how important that is as well, that there's no single way to do advocacy work, and there are ways to keep yourself safe while doing so.
Right. And that probably applies to a whole bunch of different issues, right? Like if you're taking the job example, for instance, people might say, I'm okay with trans people, but I don't like the fact that you voted for X party and, you're vocally supportive of them, or I don't like the fact that you're championing this other issue that's completely different.
Mm.
And I guess that's why people go to protests and they wear masks, right? Or they use a pseudonym, like you mentioned.
Yeah,
Is
and
that
it's oftentimes yeah, like, I'll say, people wear people wearing, like, full face masks, you might be tempted to see them as criminals, quote, unquote, but oftentimes it's just people who need to hide their identity for professional reasons or even personal safety reasons.
right? Yeah, I mean, I guess it's akin to wearing a condom when you're having sex, right? You're just protecting
Yep.
yourself from the environment around you. Hmm.
Indeed.
And I like to wrap up my episodes with what is your hope for the future and what our audience can do to help. So, to begin with, what is your hope for the future? I'm thinking specifically when it comes to trans rights in Canada.
Say my biggest hope, is to make sure people no longer have to like fear being closeted or no fear. I mean fear so much the status quo that they have to be closeted or they have to avoid coming out. I want people to no longer need to fear, that they might lose a job or lose opportunities because of who they are. I really hope, we end up in a situation where trans people no longer face like a humongous income gap. Like there's I'm not sure about current stats, but at least 2019 numbers, it was so bad to the point where you had trans people earning basically less than 60% off the av- off the median off the average income, which is horrifying, but it shouldn't be like that. I really hope, when it comes to advocacy work, that we just no longer need to fear, you know, being here. I say, as shocking as this was, there was a time, not even 3 or 4 years ago, when there were trans women running for the Conservative Party of Canada, which has since veered complete towards anti-trans shenanigans. There is hope, I'll say it. As much as, like, unfortunately now we kind of have to look back to the past and stuff, like, towards the future for hope, I nonetheless really hope that we're gonna have, a time in the future where where, where trans people can just live freely and openly without
Hmm.
fear. I really hope
Yeah.
that's where we're gonna end up in the years to come.
Yes. And I think that point about looking back to history to find hope is an unusual place to be, right? You think that progress is sort of linear and it's always uphill, but it's not. It sort of goes up and down like this. And we saw
Yeah.
that with gay folks, right? Where in the 80s, the AIDS epidemic happened. I think the gay movement lost a lot of ground, and then it started to recover probably in like the 2010s almost, right? It took a really big dive and then came back up. And I hope that we're in for the same thing with the trans movement, where we're seeing a lot of pushback now because trans people have been visible, and this, vocal minority of people have said, we don't actually like this. But eventually they're going to come around, they're going to learn that we're not a problem and that we
Also,
can be accommodated in society just like anyone else.
gonna say that, we are still like we're kind of right now living in like the last gasps of misogyny and of so much, so many other horrifying things going on. Like I'm sure, in near future, hopefully, that we're gonna live in a world in which, even things that right now we still, have to account for, like gender pay gap, can simply disappear. I really
Mhm.
hope that happens. I believe it's gonna happen one day.
Yes. Yeah, no, I hope we get there. And like you mentioned, the gender pay gap affects so many different groups. Like I saw a graph where it shows the gender pay gap between men and women, but then also between trans people, and then the difference between, when it comes to binary trans people, between trans men and trans women, for instance. And there's a difference there as well, which speaks to sexism over transphobia. And I think when you talk about that hope of what you want Canada to look like when hopefully trans people are fully accepted, what do you think that our audience can do to help us get to that future?
See, the biggest ones, just support our causes. Say if you, of course, you want to get involved in the trans movement, even just as, a pre-distant ally, you can all let us do so. There's always a group that's seeking help. There's also folks also need funds, and of course, that's also a good way to give back to communities, to like pay maybe hire a trans person, or donate to your local trans movement if you have funds. If not, you can also just be a volunteer, help out in any given cheaper form. There are so many ways to help out, I'll say. And you can, of course, use your own skills. If you're, say, a legal translator, for example, you could help, trans people get, translations for their official documents. Those are, many of the allies I work with, they do that kind of work. It can be very much that. And that's even need to go very far. It can be really close. So I'd say just think outside the box and ask, you have trans people in your life, ask them what you could do for them. It be
Right.
something as simple as cooking a meal for them every here and there, but can make a huge difference for them.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your thoughts. It's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast. This has been a social justice podcast. I'm your host, NICOLA SPURLING. Today, I've been joined by Celeste Trianon for a conversation about trans rights in Canada and a few other things as well. You've been listening to a social justice podcast, an exploration of our world's social issues, hosted by NICOLA SPURLING on the traditional and unceded territories of the Kwikwetlem, Katzie, and Qayqayt peoples.